What happens after death? Is hell real? And what if I told you that a young man died, crossed over to the other side, and returned with a horrifying message from Jesus? A revelation so shocking that it will change everything you thought you knew about the afterlife. Taylor was just a regular teenager, living his life like most people, until the day he died. But instead of peace, instead of a tunnel of light, he was pulled into something far more terrifying. He saw what awaits those who ignore God. He witnessed the book of life, the judgment, and the souls who thought they were saved, only to realize too late that they weren't. What he saw in those few minutes felt like an eternity. A vision of hell, demons that knew his name, and a warning from Jesus himself about the future of mankind. And now, he's here to tell the world before it's too late. Many people watch our videos but aren't subscribed. If you believe in Jesus, if you believe in the afterlife, and if you want to uncover the truth that few are willing to share, then subscribe now. Stay until the end, because what you're about to hear may be the most important message of your life. Some moments in life arrive without warning, shaking the very foundation of what we believe to be real. Taylor was just an ordinary teenager, caught up in the usual distractions of youth: school, friends, social media. Faith? It was something distant, something his mother spoke about but never truly captured his heart. He had heard of heaven and hell, of God and the afterlife, but those were just ideas, concepts he had never stopped to consider. Like many, he assumed he had all the time in the world. That's the trick, isn't it? The illusion that life stretches endlessly before us, that there will always be another tomorrow, another chance. But what happens when that illusion shatters? What happens when, in the blink of an eye, you find yourself face to face with the unknown? It was a day like any other. The morning routine, the usual groggy resistance to waking up, the comfort of routine. Nothing felt different. How could he have known that this would be the last time he would roll out of bed? The last time he would hear his mother's voice calling him to breakfast? Isn't that how it always is? We never recognize the final moments until they've already slipped through our fingers. As Taylor walked to school, he wasn't thinking about eternity. He wasn't reflecting on the meaning of life. His mind was occupied with weekend plans, inside jokes with his best friend, the next text message he needed to send. And then, in a single heartbeat, everything changed. Death comes like a thief, swift and without mercy. Taylor never saw it coming. One moment, he was standing by his locker, laughing with a friend. The next, the world around him exploded in chaos. A deafening screech, the flash of headlights, a force beyond comprehension slamming into his body. He felt it, every nerve screaming in protest, the violent jerk of impact, the weightlessness before everything went dark. Is that what dying feels like? A sudden, violent interruption? Or is it something deeper, something more unsettling, the realization that everything you thought mattered no longer does? The silence that followed was unnatural, eerie. Time seemed to stand still. There was no pain, no breath, no heartbeat. Yet Taylor was still aware. A presence, an unsettling sensation that something was horribly wrong. And then he saw it, his own body, crumpled and lifeless on the pavement, blood pooling beneath his head. People were rushing, screaming. His friend was kneeling beside him, shaking his shoulders, calling his name with a voice laced in terror. But Taylor wasn't there anymore. At least, not in the way he once was. He was floating, watching, disconnected. Is this what happens after death? Is this proof of the afterlife? The thought barely had time to form before something else took hold. Something strong, unseen, relentless. A force, pulling him away, dragging him from the scene, towards something he could not see but could feel in every fiber of his being. What happens after death? It's a question humanity has wrestled with for centuries. Theories, philosophies, beliefs, none of them mattered in that moment. Taylor was no longer wondering. He was experiencing it, and it wasn't peaceful. There was no tunnel of light, no warm embrace. Instead, there was a force, a pull that was neither gentle nor kind. It was as if something had claimed him, something that had been waiting just beyond the veil. He tried to resist, but it was useless. This was real. This was happening. And whatever was on the other side, it wasn't what he had been expecting. Imagine for a moment seeing yourself from the outside, not in a dream, not in a reflection, but as an observer, detached from the very body you once inhabited. That was Taylor's reality. Suspended above the scene of his own death, he saw everything with an eerie clarity. His body lay twisted on the pavement, motionless, surrounded by a flurry of panicked voices. The weight of life was gone. No heartbeat, no breath, no pain. Yet he was still there, conscious, aware. It didn't make sense. Was this what people meant by an out-of-body experience? Was this the proof of the afterlife that so many had questioned? Below him, the world moved in slow motion. His best friend's face was a mask of terror, hands trembling as she tried to shake him awake. Strangers gathered, some shouting for help, others frozen in shock. And then the sirens, loud, piercing, yet strangely distant. It was surreal, like watching a scene unfold from a movie, only this wasn't a movie. This was real. The weight of grief in the air was almost tangible. People were crying, praying. But Taylor, he was hovering above it all, untouched by their desperation. He tried to call out, to reach for them, but his hands passed through like smoke. He had no form, no substance. Was this death? Was this what happens after you die? At first, there was no fear, only confusion. He had always thought of life after death as something distant, abstract, something that happened to other people, not him. And yet, here he was, existing outside his body, witnessing his own death like a spectator. If this was real, then what else was? Heaven? Hell? Judgment? The questions came in waves, but before he could process them, something shifted. A presence, cold, unrelenting, began pulling him away. It was subtle at first, like a current beneath his feet, but quickly grew stronger. He resisted, but there was nothing to fight against. It wasn't hands that pulled him. It was a force, something unseen, yet terrifyingly powerful. He turned his gaze upward, expecting to see the light, the kind that so many near-death testimonies described. But there was no light, no warmth, no embrace. Instead, the world around him darkened, the sounds of sirens and sobs fading into a deafening silence. The further he was pulled, the less connected he felt to the world he had known. It was as if he was slipping between two realities, one he recognized and one that had been waiting just beyond the veil. The weight of eternity pressed in on him. He wasn't just watching his death. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known. Then, a realization gripped him. He wasn't in control. Whatever was pulling him had authority over him. And that thought, more than the accident, more than the chaos below, filled him with terror. What if this wasn't the path to heaven? What if he wasn't going up at all? Panic clawed at him, but it was too late. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. There's something deeply unsettling about falling when there's no ground beneath you, no end, no bottom, just an endless descent into something you can't see but can feel in your very soul. Taylor had always heard that when you die, you're supposed to see a tunnel of light, a gateway to something beautiful. But there was no light here, no gentle hands reaching for him, no voices of long-lost relatives welcoming him home. There was only darkness, thick, suffocating, and alive. At first, it was quiet, eerily so. But then, the whispers started, faint at first, slithering through the abyss like serpents in the dark. They weren't comforting. They weren't kind. They were taunting, accusing, filled with malice. Words he couldn't fully understand, yet somehow, deep in his spirit, he knew their meaning. They spoke of regrets, chances, of choices that could never be undone. Every lie he had told, every moment he had ignored faith, every time he had chosen the world over God, these whispers knew it all. Near-death experiences often spoke of warmth, of peace. But this was something else entirely. Shapes began forming in the darkness. At first, just shifting shadows, impossible to define. But the longer he fell, the clearer they became. Figures, twisted, unnatural, lurking just beyond his vision. They didn't move like people. They slithered, flickered, always just out of reach. And yet, their presence was overwhelming. He could feel them watching, waiting. He knew instinctively that they weren't human, but what terrified him most wasn't what they were. It was the fact that they knew him, not just his name, but his soul. And then a voice, not a whisper, not a murmur, but a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the abyss. "You don't belong here yet." The weight of those words crushed him. Yet. That meant he was on the way, that this was where he was headed. Panic surged through him. This wasn't some nightmare he could wake up from. This was reality, more real than anything he had ever known. If this was proof of the afterlife, then it was a terrifying one. The descent grew colder. Not a physical cold, but a deep, soul-freezing chill, the kind that made him feel like something precious was being stripped away. He tried to scream, to cry out for help, but his voice was swallowed by the void. No one could hear him. No one was coming. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be lost. Just when Taylor thought all hope was lost, when the darkness felt like it had fully consumed him, something changed. A voice. Not like the whispers, not like the guttural growls of the abyss, but something different. It wasn't just heard, it was felt. A voice that carried authority, power, and undeniable presence. Enough. The single word shattered the darkness like a lightning bolt. Everything froze. The figures that lurked in the shadows recoiled, the whispers silenced. The abyss itself seemed to tremble. And then, there was light. Not just any light. This was a radiance unlike anything Taylor had ever seen. It wasn't just brightness. It was alive. It pushed back the void, filled every space it touched, and with it came something even more overwhelming, a presence so vast, so holy, that Taylor couldn't stand it. He felt exposed, as if every thought, every action, every hidden part of his soul was being laid bare. But it wasn't just power he felt. It was love. A love so deep, so pure, that it simultaneously broke him and rebuilt him in the same instant. And then he saw him, Jesus. The moment Taylor laid eyes on him, he knew. There was no doubt, no hesitation. This was the one the world spoke of, the one people worshipped, the one he had ignored for most of his life. His presence was overwhelming, consuming, undeniable. He wasn't just light, he was the source of light itself. His robe shimmered with purity beyond human comprehension, and his eyes pierced through Taylor's very being. They weren't just looking at him. They were seeing him. Every thought, every sin, every moment of doubt and disbelief. Yet despite all of it, his gaze was filled with sorrow, not anger. With love, not condemnation. Jesus raised his hand, and in that instant the darkness screamed. The abyss recoiled. The shadows twisted and shrieked, fleeing from his very presence. The forces that had been dragging Taylor down were now powerless. The authority of Christ had spoken, and nothing, not the demons, not the darkness, not death itself, could defy it. "You were not meant to be here," Jesus said. And with those words, Taylor realized something chilling. He had been headed there by his own choices, but Jesus didn't just pull him from the abyss. He was about to show Taylor something more, something deeper, something that would change the way he saw everything forever. The light around Taylor didn't fade, but it shifted, becoming something more than just brightness. It was knowledge, truth, revelation. He wasn't just standing before Jesus, he was standing before judgment itself. And then it began. Without warning, his entire life unfolded before him. Every moment, every action, every thought, as if it were being played on a screen he couldn't look away from. But this wasn't just a memory reel. He wasn't just seeing his past, he was feeling it. Every decision he had ever made, every time he had chosen selfishness over kindness, every time he had pushed God aside for distractions, it all came crashing down on him with the full weight of reality. And it wasn't just the bad moments. It was the missed opportunities, the times he could have shown love but didn't, the times he could have helped but walked away. He saw people he had hurt, sometimes with words, sometimes with indifference. He saw his mother praying for him at night while he rolled his eyes at her faith. He saw the people he had mocked for believing in something greater, and he felt their pain as if it were his own. Then, the review shifted. Taylor saw moments where God had tried to reach him, whispers in his heart, warnings he had ignored. The times he had felt an unexplained urge to pray, but shrugged it off. The moments of conviction he had drowned out with distractions. The times when Jesus had been so close, yet Taylor had chosen to turn away. "You were never alone," Jesus said. And those words pierced deeper than anything he had ever felt. Taylor wanted to look away. He wanted to explain himself, to justify, to say, "I was just living my life." But deep down, he knew. He had chosen this path. And yet Jesus wasn't showing him this to condemn him, but to wake him up. Because the next thing Taylor saw would shake him to his very core. Before Taylor could fully process the weight of his life review, the vision shifted. The warmth of Jesus' presence dimmed, and suddenly he was elsewhere. The air grew heavy, thick with an unbearable stench, burning, decay, something beyond anything earthly. The light faded, replaced by a vast, endless pit. It stretched in every direction, deeper than the eye could see, filled with movement, yet void of life. And then came the screams. It wasn't just one voice, or 10, or 100. It was millions, crying out in torment, voices layered upon voices, a never-ending wave of suffering. Some cursed God, some begged for mercy, some wailed in regret. But all of them shared one thing in common: they could not escape. This was hell. Not a metaphor, not a warning. It was real, and it was worse than he had ever imagined. Taylor saw figures writhing in agony, their faces twisted in pain, their bodies bound by chains they had forged in life. The fire wasn't like earthly fire. It didn't just burn the flesh. It burned the soul. And the worst part? It never stopped. There was no relief, no rest, no escape. He saw some trying to climb out, only to be dragged back down by shadowy creatures, their laughter cold and mocking. He recognized some of them, people from his own life, a boy from school, a teacher, a neighbor, people who had laughed at faith, who had mocked the idea of judgment. And now, their faces were filled with horror and regret. Then the shadows moved, and Taylor saw them. Demons. Not the kind depicted in movies, not horned creatures with pitchforks. These were worse. Twisted, grotesque, shifting between forms. Their eyes burned with hatred and hunger, and they knew him. "You were almost ours," one hissed, its voice slithering into his mind. "You still could be." Taylor wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. He felt something clawing at his leg, pulling him down. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be here. But the truth struck him like a hammer. Without Jesus, this was exactly where he had been heading. And just as the abyss was about to swallow him whole, a voice thundered through the darkness. "Enough!" The fire trembled. The demons shrieked, and in an instant, the light returned. The light that saved Taylor from the abyss was blinding, but it wasn't just brightness. It was authority, justice, and undeniable truth. The suffocating darkness of hell faded, and suddenly, he found himself somewhere entirely different. A place of overwhelming majesty, reverence, and finality. He knew where he was before anyone told him. This was the judgment. Before him stretched a vast, endless expanse, but at its center stood something unmistakable: the gates of heaven. They weren't just a structure. They were alive with glory, radiating purity beyond human comprehension. People stood before them, their faces filled with hope, fear, desperation. But what shook Taylor the most was what he saw next. Not everyone was being allowed to enter. He watched as souls stepped forward, their voices trembling. "Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons, done many wonderful works?" Matthew 7:22. These weren't murderers, thieves, or wicked men. They were believers, churchgoers, people who had lived good lives. And yet, the voice that responded sent chills down Taylor's spine. "I never knew you. Depart from me." Matthew 7:23. The weight of those words crushed the very air around him. Taylor watched in horror as these souls, people who had thought they were saved, were pulled away, dragged into the shadows. Their cries for mercy went unanswered, not because God was cruel, but because they had never truly given their hearts to him. They had spoken his name, but never surrendered their lives. They had performed religious rituals, but never truly followed him. Taylor's heart pounded. How many people were living under this illusion? How many had assumed they were safe, only to be met with rejection? He thought about himself. How many times had he ignored the warnings, believing he had more time? How many others were still living? That same deception right now? And then, Taylor saw something even more terrifying. His name had not yet been called. Taylor's breath caught in his throat as he watched the souls disappear into the darkness. The weight of eternity pressed against him like an invisible force. Then, without a word, Jesus lifted his hand, and suddenly, before them appeared a book unlike anything Taylor had ever seen. It was massive, glowing with an otherworldly light. The Book of Life. This was it. The record of those who truly belonged to God. Not just those who had claimed to believe, but those who had lived in surrender, in faith, in true devotion. Taylor's entire body tensed as the pages turned, each covered in names that shimmered like heavenly fire. Some names were bold, radiant, untouchable. Others were fading, slowly dissolving as if they had never been there. Taylor's stomach dropped. People's names were disappearing. His eyes widened as he recognized some of them. People from his school. People who had gone to church. People who had once spoken about God. And yet their names were vanishing from the pages, erased as if they had never mattered. Why? What had they done? Or worse, what had they failed to do? Jesus turned to him, his expression filled with sorrow. "Many begin the race, but few endure to the end." Matthew 24:13. The meaning was clear. Some had once followed but had turned away. They had started strong, but compromise, sin, and the distractions of the world had led them off course. And now, their eternity was slipping through their fingers. Taylor felt his chest tighten. Could that have been him? Had his name ever been written there? Was it still there now? The fear of not knowing was unbearable. Then, Jesus looked directly into his soul, and with a voice filled with both power and deep sorrow, he spoke. "Few find the narrow path, Taylor, but you still have a choice." Just as Taylor began to grasp the weight of the Book of Life, the vision shifted again. The radiance of heaven dimmed, and in its place, a terrifying scene unfolded before his eyes. It was not the past, nor the present. It was the future, a glimpse into what was coming. Cities burned. The sky was thick with smoke and fire, a choking darkness covering the land. People ran in every direction, their faces filled with panic, confusion, and terror. Buildings crumbled, storms raged, the earth itself trembled. Taylor could hear the sounds of war, of violence, of nations collapsing. This wasn't just another tragedy. This was the end. But what disturbed him even more was what he saw among the people. They weren't crying out to God. They weren't repenting. They were blind, distracted, consumed by their own desires, their own pride, their own pursuits. Some were mocking the destruction around them, as if it were all just a joke. Others were celebrating, indulging in their pleasures, even as the world crumbled around them. They had no idea what was coming next. And then, Taylor saw them, the shadows moving among the people, figures, demonic and twisted, whispering lies into their ears. Lies of comfort, of deception, of false peace. There's still time. Nothing is happening. God won't judge you. And the people believed them. Even as the world fell apart, they refused to turn back. Taylor turned to Jesus, his voice trembling. Why aren't they seeing this? Why aren't they waking up? Jesus' eyes were heavy with sorrow. Because they do not want to see. A cold realization struck Taylor. This was happening now. The world was already being lulled into a spiritual sleep, distracted by meaningless things while eternity was at stake. He saw people scrolling through their phones, obsessed with entertainment, wealth, and pleasure, ignoring every sign, every warning. He saw churches filled with people who called themselves believers, but whose hearts were far from God. Then Jesus spoke again. As in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24:37-39. Taylor's breath caught in his throat. In the days of Noah, people lived as if nothing was wrong, until the flood came and swept them away. This was the same. The world was laughing, playing, indulging, while judgment loomed just beyond the horizon. And then Taylor saw it. The moment that would change everything. A shift in the heavens. A sound like a trumpet, deafening and powerful. And in an instant, it was too late. As the vision of destruction faded, Taylor's heart pounded. He had just witnessed the end. Chaos, deception, and countless souls unaware of what awaited them. He turned to Jesus, desperate for answers. Can't they be saved? Isn't there still time? Jesus' expression was solemn, filled with both love and sorrow. The door is still open, he said, but not for long. At that moment, Taylor saw something immense and radiant appear before him, a massive door stretching beyond the horizon. It shimmered with an ethereal glow, pulsing with a divine presence. This was the doorway to salvation, the entrance to eternity. But something was wrong. It was slowly closing. People were rushing toward it, some running with urgency, others walking casually, unaware of the closing gap. Some hesitated at the threshold, uncertain. Others stood at a distance, mocking, doubting, ignoring. And still, the door continued to close. Taylor's breath caught as he recognized some of the faces. Friends, family members, people he had known his whole life. Some were reaching for the door, but it was already too late. It shut before they could enter. Their cries of, "Wait, let us in," were met with a final, chilling reply. "I do not know you." Luke 13:25-27. The sound of the door locking echoed through eternity. The ones outside fell to their knees, weeping, begging, but there were no second chances. Taylor turned to Jesus, his entire body trembling. They didn't know. They thought they had more time. Jesus looked at him, his voice gentle but firm. "I have given them time. I have sent warnings, but they have chosen the world over me." Taylor's mind raced. How many people were living as if they had forever? How many thought they could get right with God later? He had been one of them, until now. Then, Jesus fixed his gaze on Taylor and said words that burned into his soul forever. "Go back, warn them, tell them before the door closes." And with those words, everything shifted. The moment Jesus spoke those words, Taylor felt a force pulling him back. Not like the suffocating grip of the abyss, but something different. A mission, a purpose, a divine command. Before he could speak, before he could plead to stay, the entire vision collapsed around him. The radiance of heaven, the weight of judgment, the closing door, all of it vanished. And then, pain. His chest burned, his lungs gasped for air, his body convulsed. Voices screamed around him. "We have a pulse! He's back!" Blinding lights filled his eyes, and the unbearable weight of his body pressed against him once more. He was alive, but nothing was the same. Taylor lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with everything he had just seen. The book of life, the judgment, the people crying outside the closed door. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was real, more real than anything he had ever experienced. And now, he had to do something about it. The next few days were a blur. Doctors, nurses, family members weeping at his bedside. They told him he had been dead for 3 minutes. 3 minutes? It felt like eternity. His mother sobbed, calling it a miracle. His friends were shaken but dismissed it as a close call. No one understood, but Taylor knew. He had been sent back for a reason, not for himself, but for them. For the millions of people walking toward the closing door, unaware that it would soon be shut forever. For the ones living as if they had all the time in the world, when in reality, their time was slipping away with every breath. And so he began to speak, at first only to his family, his mother, his father, his siblings. Their reactions varied: shock, tears, disbelief. But something in his voice, something in his eyes, told them that this was not just a story. Then he told his friends. Some laughed, joking that he had seen the light. Others listened, their expressions uneasy. A few turned away, unwilling to hear. But he didn't stop. Taylor had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. The world needed to hear. People needed to know, because the door was closing, and soon there would be no time left. Taylor thought that after returning, everything would be clear, peaceful, simple, but he couldn't have been more wrong. The battle hadn't ended. It had only just begun. The first few nights were the worst. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the abyss. He could hear the whispers, feel the cold, see the faces of those trapped in eternal regret. It wasn't a dream. It was a reminder, a warning. They were still there, and they knew he had escaped. Then came the shadows, dark figures lurking at the edges of his vision, flickering in and out of sight. He felt them watching, waiting. They couldn't touch him, but they wanted to. Every night he woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, feeling as if something had just left the room. He barely slept, and when he did, the nightmares came. But the worst attack wasn't fear. It was doubt. It was all in your head. It wasn't real. You're just imagining things. The thoughts whispered into his mind like venom, planting seeds of uncertainty. He knew where they were coming from. The enemy. The same forces that had tried to claim him in death were now trying to silence him in life. That's when Taylor remembered what he had seen, the authority of Jesus, the way the darkness had trembled at his voice, the way hell itself had recoiled at his presence. And he realized something. He didn't have to fight this battle alone. So, he prayed. First, it felt awkward, forced. He wasn't used to praying, not like this. But then he remembered the words of Jesus. Behold, I give you authority over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. Luke 10:19. Taylor spoke that authority out loud, and the moment he did, the fear broke. The attacks didn't stop immediately, but they weakened. Every time the shadows appeared, he rebuked them in the name of Jesus. Every time doubt whispered in his mind, he spoke truth from Scripture, and it worked. For the first time, Taylor understood what it meant to wage spiritual war. The enemy had tried to claim him. They had failed. But they would never stop trying, not just with him, but with anyone who chose the truth. And that meant one thing: he had to keep fighting. And he had to warn others to do the same. As Taylor stepped back into everyday life, he expected people to see things differently. Surely if they knew the truth, they would change, right? If they heard what he had seen, if they understood how real it was, they would wake up, repent, turn to God. But they didn't. Instead, he watched in shock as the world continued as if nothing had happened. People scrolled through their phones, obsessed with trends, gossip, and entertainment. They filled their time with work, relationships, distractions, anything to avoid thinking about eternity. He saw friends who had once been curious about his story quickly lose interest, brushing it off with, "That's crazy, man," or, "You really believe that stuff?" Even those who claimed to be Christians treated his testimony like just another interesting tale, rather than a wake-up call. And then it hit him. This is exactly what Jesus had shown him. The world was asleep, just like in Noah's time when people laughed at the warning until the flood came, Matthew 24:37-39. People today were distracted, unaware that time was running out. It wasn't that they openly rejected God, they just didn't care. They were too busy, too entertained, too comfortable in their routines. But Taylor knew the truth. This world is not permanent. He saw people chasing after money, fame, security, thinking it would last forever. But he had seen what happens when life ends. None of it mattered. Not the status, not the wealth, not the followers on social media. What mattered was their soul. Taylor wanted to shake them, to make them see, to yell, "Wake up, don't you see what's coming?" But he knew only God could open their eyes. That didn't mean he would stop trying. If people were too blind to recognize the truth on their own, then he would bring the truth to them. However long he had left, he would spend it making sure no one could say they hadn't been warned. Taylor knew he couldn't stay silent. He had been given a second chance for a reason. What he saw wasn't just for him. It was a warning for everyone. So he spoke, at first only to those closest to him, his family, his friends, his church. Some listened, their eyes filling with tears as he described the horror of hell, the beauty of heaven, the urgency of Jesus' words. Others dismissed him, saying he must have been hallucinating. Some even mocked him. "You really think you saw Jesus? It was just your brain playing tricks on you." But Taylor didn't let it stop him, because he knew the truth. He saw what happens when people ignore the warnings. He saw the names fading from the book of life. He saw the people left outside the closing door, crying out too late. He saw hell, and he knew how easily people ended up there, without even realizing it. So he kept going. He started sharing his story online, speaking in churches, warning anyone who would listen. Not everyone believed him, but some did, and that was enough. If even one person turned back to God because of what he had seen, then it was worth it. Taylor didn't know how much time he had left, but he knew one thing for certain. He would use every moment to tell people the truth, because soon the door would close. And once it did, there would be no going back. Now that you've heard Taylor's story, what do you think happens after death? Do you believe his near-death experience was a warning for all of us? Let me know in the comments. Your opinion matters more than you think. If this message shook you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden truths about the afterlife, faith, and eternity, make sure to subscribe and turn on all notifications so you never miss a video. And before you go, click on the next video on your screen because there's still so much more you need to know.